Hello, today I want to share with you my thinking on how I use the Comprehension Instruction Planning and Observation Reflection tool in order to plan my comprehension instruction. So this is what the template looks like, and it's really designed to be used one template per day. The reason why I wouldn't want to necessarily plan for multiple days on this one document is that my learning target or my focus might shift as I scaffold across the week. I'll show you what that looks like in my example. So for me, I use the story Akiak, which is in the 4th grade Hoot and Mifflin series. Now, the first thing I wanted to do is to really think about what was the text, how was the text complex, and how could I use this text in order to teach the curriculum that I need at 4th grade. Right away, I knew that the standards that I needed to teach for at the beginning of the year had to do with describing characters, setting, and plot events in detail. So I figured I'm probably going to get at some point to that standard where we're going to be looking either at the setting or at the characters and describing them in detail. I also wanted to consider the complexity of the text. So I know when I'm planning my comprehension grade level instruction that I want to make sure that I'm using grade level complexity of text. I looked up the Lexile of this text, and it's right at that 590. Now, that's a little bit low. That actually falls in that 2nd and 3rd grade band. It is in the Hoot and Mifflin series, though, which helped me to feel like it should be appropriate to 4th grade. So I dug a little deeper into looking at what were the specific areas of complexity. The topic of this particular story is a dog running the Iditarod. So the knowledge demands could be fairly high. Kids may not know much about that topic. There's also some different language demands, some figurative language or descriptive language that may be challenging for students. And the text structure could be challenging at times. At times we're jumping in our setting, following one set of characters, and then moving to another set of characters. So overall, the Lexile is a little bit low, but there was enough complexity in these other areas that made me feel like it would be appropriate. However, I would want to keep that in mind that with this Lexile being lower here, that the next story I choose to read might want to be a higher Lexile just so I can have that range of experiences for my students. Now, like I said, after I had found my complex text, the next thing I wanted to think about was how it connected to my curriculum. Our first power standard is describing character, setting, and plot events in detail. So right away, my first thought was I'm going to use Akiak, and I'm going to describe characters, since that's the first part of my standard. As I started reading through that lens, analyzing characters became very obvious. It even says right at the end of the story that Akiak was a courageous dog. I didn't feel like that was aligned with the level of complexity that I needed. If the story is just going to tell me the level or describe the characters in detail, then it probably isn't as complex as I need. What I did notice about this story, though, is the uniqueness of the setting. The fact that parts of the story are following Akiak and parts of the story are following the dog team. And it wasn't always super clear when and where you were following what. So I thought that actually might be a better place to increase the complexity of this task by really having kids first identify the setting, who are we following, where are we at, and then eventually scaffold into describing the setting in detail. So already I'm thinking flexibly and changing my plans based on what I know about the complexity of the text and in the standards. So I started reading with that mindset, looking at the setting and how I could analyze the setting. When I got done with my first read, I had a whole scrolling page worth of things that I wanted to talk about with this particular text. And I felt like if I didn't start to address some of those things, that we wouldn't be able to really dig deeply into the setting like I wanted. So I made one more change to my plan, and that was to add one more day at the beginning of the week so that I could really focus on some basic level comprehension and talking through what the author was providing in the text. For me, I felt like I could accomplish that if we were working on inferring. So after I walked through the text and really thought about my instructional focus, I identified 3 main things I wanted to work on with this story. In the beginning, I just wanted the kids to read the story, to understand the story, and to do that we were going to use inferring. On day 2, I wanted us to shift our focus closer to our grade level standard, which was character, setting, and plot, but I didn't think we were ready to analyze the setting in detail yet. I thought we just needed to identify the setting, especially knowing how the setting kind of jumps around. So day 2, we really focused on identifying the setting. Then finally, on day 3, I felt like we were ready to hit home what the standard was really asking, which was describing the setting in detail. So you could see how the flexibility of the plan is nice because each day that I made a lesson plan, I could just rearrange based on the sequence of what I felt like I needed to do in order to make this text accessible to all students. So now that you have kind of that big picture of how the instruction is going to lay out, let's walk through each part of the plan. The first thing that I needed to do was activate background knowledge. A big thing here is that this needs to be active on the parts of student, and I need to think about what is the level of background knowledge. Because the topic is the Iditarod, I didn't feel like many students would have much knowledge, so I had to choose a strategy that would help to build that without actually giving away everything I was asking students to learn from the text. This link here was really helpful because it provided numerous different strategies. Because I'm assuming that students have low background knowledge, it suggested using a video. So I chose a video that just gave a very basic outline of what is the Iditarod. I wanted to make sure that it didn't go into detail about really describing the harsh winter conditions because that's what I want them to analyze in the setting. So I really had to be careful with whatever background knowledge tool I provided that it didn't do the work for kiddos. After watching the video, I felt like they would have had enough of an understanding to be able to start to identify what they think they know and what they want to learn more. I, as a teacher, would probably do the first 2 examples just to show them what this graphic organizer looked like, and then I was going to turn my students loose to be able to brainstorm what they think they know about this story and about this topic and what they want to learn. I added one more thing to building background knowledge here. This story does have several words that I thought would be challenging to decode, specifically because of the names. And so I wanted to just take a moment to quickly run through these words and help them to map the different syllables because I want the cognitive complexity to fall on analyzing the text, not decoding the text. So that was just one small extra thing that I added here to build background knowledge. Once I had students actively building background knowledge, I wanted to transition into vocabulary. I picked several Tier 2 words that I felt like could span numerous different texts, and I provided for them an explicit definition and several different activities where they could apply those words. We want students to have repetition with applying that word. Because this is a piece of literature, I would explicitly teach it in the context of the story or after we had finished reading. I also identified several words that are important for comprehension in the moment, but probably not going to be very transferable, or they could be taught in just that quick context using context clues. These are words that I'm going to fast scaffold. Once I had figured out what my vocabulary was, I was ready to move on to my actual instruction. So like I said, in my first round, when I looked at these lists of possible instructional focuses, I decided what I was going to focus on was comprehension monitoring strategies. This would let me get my initial read of the text, build a general mental model of the story, and then eventually come back and dig into setting deeper with future reads. So after finding my focus, I explicitly defined what is an inference. I made sure that that learning target was clear for students and the strategy that we would use in order to meet our learning target. And then I wanted to explain to them why that learning was important, so there was relevance to them. I went through the gradual release model, having several I do examples, some we do examples, and then some you do together examples. And then in the end, I wanted to really solidify what was that learning outcome that we were working on. So we had a class discussion that came back to that learning target and the importance of that learning. There were other small incidental things that I wanted to talk about in this story, but I didn't put them all here in my plan because I really wanted to preserve the clarity of my instructional focus. We are working on the inferring strategy, and so I made sure that everything that I wrote down here was really focused on inferring. Now, all of this was the gradual release within the context of Akiak. I also want students to be able to apply inferring strategies to their own reading as well. So during core application, I developed structures for independent application. I wanted them to read their own good fit text and then find 3 quotes and explain what inferences they could make from those quotes. So I'm taking the same strategies that we practiced together with Akiak and having them do that during core application. The last thing that we have on this plan is to help us remember to transfer beyond just our literacy block. So I didn't necessarily have to put any planning here, but it's just a good reminder to think about where can we use inferring strategies in social studies or in other content areas beyond just our 90-minute reading period. So that was day number 1, all with that clear focus on inferring. Day number 2, we continued with Akiak, but like I said, this time we're going to transition a little bit closer to our power standard, and we're going to work on just identifying the setting, kind of tracking through how the characters are moving and which characters we're following. To build our background knowledge, we continue to come back to our KWL. We are actively building background knowledge here by confirming what we actually learned was true in our K, by correcting anything that maybe we thought was true and wasn't actually true, and then elaborating. We could have also started to answer any of our W questions and brainstormed anything additional in the learned column. So kids are actively reflecting on what they thought they knew, what they wanted to learn, and now what they are learning as a result of the story. It's very active in the students' hands. I kept my vocabulary words the same because we know that sometimes it takes multiple days for kids to really build automaticity with those words, but I did change my application activities so they have a different way of practicing them. For this day's instructional focus, I shifted more to where we have the Iowa Core Standards. We haven't quite hit all the way on the standard. We're not describing in detail yet, but we're getting closer to what the intention of that standard is. Now, it does also kind of address story structure because of the nature of the standard, and definitely some close reading strategies as well because we're reading closely to try to figure out where we are in the story. But my instructional focus in my mind, the clarity is coming from teaching an Iowa Core Standard, so I wanted that clarity. Much of what you'll see over here is the same as above. I defined any necessary terms. I made the learning target clear, the strategy clear, and the importance for students. I made sure that I had my gradual release of I do, we do, and you do. And then I wrapped up with having us come back to that learning target and having some discussion to solidify that instructional focus. When I planned for independent application, I had students using the same skills that we were working on before, using signal words to identify setting in their own independent reading during core application. So you can really see the alignment of the skill across my whole literacy block. Kids are very clear on what it is we're working on. On day number 3, now I'm actually getting to the full demands of that standard. We are describing the setting in detail. So this is our third read of the story. We could be skimming and scanning, or we could coming back to specific passages and excerpts to read, or we could be reading the whole thing again. But the instructional focus you see has shifted slightly each day, which is why I used a different template each day. Our activating background knowledge was the same thing. We're continuing to build our knowledge using our KWL. Our vocabulary did change this time because of our instructional focus. Because I want the students to be able to describe the setting in detail, I wanted them to have the academic words that they needed in order to do so. So I had held off earlier in my lessons from describing or from defining certain words that I thought could be particularly helpful with today's target. So today, the words I'm explicitly teaching are rugged and bitter because those will help us to describe the setting in detail. And even my fast scaffold words, steep, pounding across the snow, biting wind, clung like a shadow, all of these are things that I think will also help us when it comes to meeting today's target. So I made sure that I was thinking about which vocabulary words would best serve my instructional needs each day. Again, when I thought about the explicit skills that I was going to teach, now I'm solidly in this section here where I'm teaching an Iowa Core Standard. Much of what you'll see here is the same though. I defined any relevant academic terms. I clearly defined my learning target with students. I've defined the strategies that we'll be using and why this learning is important. Because we're now really hitting on the essence of the standard, I also included my success criteria so students could be very clear on what it looks like when they've met that target. I use the I do, we do, you do model so that we're gradually releasing that skill to students. And then we have that class discussion to bring us back to our learning target and to solidify that importance of that learning. For our transfer, or for solidifying that skill in independent application, what I'm asking them to do is while they're reading their story during core application, that they need to pick one of the settings and describe it in detail. They'll use the same strategies of what they had learned and applied during shared reading. So again, you see that nice flow across the shared reading experience to their independent reading of applying those strategies. So that's kind of the big picture of how I use that comprehension instruction planning tool. The big thing I feel like is making sure that we start by analyzing the text and knowing where is the complexity of that text and what skills we need to teach to make that text come alive for students. After I figured out what that instructional focus or multiple foci would be, then I go through and I think about how I can use the vocabulary to support that planning, what I need to do to actively have students build their background knowledge, and then how I can gradually release practice of that skill all the way from our shared reading experience to their core application experience. If you have any questions, I have this document with some of my thoughts kind of defined off on the right-hand side. Feel free to reach out to your instructional coach or to myself as the curriculum lead to help you with any planning. Have a great day.